Hi everyone, we've been taking a look at the major cultural developments of the 18th century and into the early 19th century with the developments of neoclassicism and romanticism. Today I want to take a look at the movement towards modernism. Modernism as a cultural movement, and also modernism as a historical movement. There's going to be some radical changes that are happening during the 19th century. They're going to change the way that we see the world, that we see each other, and then art is going to change and reflect that. And so there's two main movements that I wanted to examine this week, realism and impressionism, and both of them in some ways are interrelated, have very similar kind of approaches. Aesthetically, they're going to look very different, but they're going to have similar underpinnings. So they're going to be responding to a similar climate of a world that's on the horizon to change, right? And so there's this kind of transitionary world. And I want to take a look at Victorianism. Traditionally, I would put Victorianism as a subset of Romanticism. Romanticism is kind of this umbrella term that encompasses British Romantic poetry, encompasses the Sturm und Drang movement of Germany, encompasses Victorianism of England, transcendentalism. It's a big movement that has a lot of little moving pieces to it, and Victorianism is one of them. And I wanted to take a look at this because the Victorianism is going to be this kind of transitionary period where it's coming at the tail end of Romanticism and moving into modernism, right? Victorianism is a transitionary period between Romanticism and modernism. It was named after Queen Victoria of England, and so she has this vast lifespan that spans all the way into the 20th century. And she's going to have a large influence on cultural manifestation, the way that she sees the world. Her strict moral codes are going to have a lasting effect. It's going to have this rippling effect throughout England, and also is going to cross the Atlantic into the United States, interestingly. Even though the United States is independent, it's culturally going to influence a lot of, there's going to be some similarities happening. We're going to be influenced or inspired by a lot of the great British writers and artists, and so those ideas are going to come and influence the United States, right? Cultural manifestations such as art and literature focus on refined social manners and strict mores. So the idea of how we interact, there has to be a very sophisticated guidebook of how men and women interact, how society should interact, and so you have to follow these codes. If you don't follow the codes, then you're considered uncouth or uncultured, right? It's a period marked by destruction and reconstruction, and has an almost unyielding faith and hope in tomorrow. And so it's this idea that we are different, we're changing, we're not exactly sure what that means that we're changing, but we know that tomorrow is going to be better. We know that we're headed as human beings in the right direction, right? So that's kind of the essence of Victorianism. I want to take a look at two main Victorian novels that come out of this that encapsulate the era, right? So they kind of are embodiments of some of the main ideas, right? The first one is Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. It's a story about an orphan who overcomes his difficult circumstances in the orphanage and life on the streets as he becomes a pickpocket, to eventually becoming successful at the end. Sorry, a bit of a spoiler alert there. The novel examined in industrializing London with this increasing population that has led to a growth in crime and exploitation of children. So in terms of this transitionary period, we have the Industrial Revolution that's happening. We talked about this and how the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century brought about some major changes in terms of the American Revolution and the French Revolution with the rising bourgeoisie class. These efforts are going to continue on. There's going to be a second Industrial Revolution that happens in the 19th century that's also going to have some major social effects. Not necessarily as big of political transitions as we saw in the 18th century, but there's going to be some major social effects. And so one of them is going to be this idea that that we're no longer born in our station in life. We're no longer born in whatever socioeconomic status our parents were born into. We can now rise above it, right? So Oliver Twist is this, we would call it in the United States, we would call it the American dream. But in England, they don't call it the American dream because they're English. And in Germany, they don't call it the American dream. It's generally referred to as the bourgeoisie dream, right? This idea of coming from lower class and rising up to become part of the upper class, right? Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility is another Victorian novel that helps to capture the essence of the time. It's a story about two sisters, Eleanor and Marianne, who are complete opposites. One is rational, the other is emotional. They seek to be married and live happily ever after, and they dream of a better life through love and wealth. And so mainly what happens in many of Jane Austen's novels is that you have a very overbearing mother that wants to marry off her daughters to very wealthy people. And the whole idea is to rise above one's status through, in this case, marriage, in Oliver Twist's case, through hard work, determination, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, because women have different social restrictions on them, the way to rise above one social class is through marriage. And so the idea of, opportunity excess, the idea of moving upward is a Victorian ideal. It really takes root in England, right? And I think that most of them, we see similar ideas in Pride and Prejudice. If you've read Pride and Prejudice, the whole idea of Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth falls in love with him as soon as she goes to his estate at Pemberley. Then she kind of starts to see him differently and then finally falls in love with his massive pocketbook, right? Similar ideas, right? That's kind of a very problematic reading of the story, but it captures the sense, right? The Victorian era is marked by the Industrial Revolution and some of these major transitions, social transitions that are happening, right? John Stuart Mill argued, right? He's a writer at the time. He says that people are no longer born into their place, but are free to choose their own faculties to achieve the most favorable lot. And so this idea of rising up above one's social status. And we've seen this happen in Holland with the rising social status of people that are becoming, into the trade industry. And we saw the rising class and how that affected people in Holland. This is now starting to take roots in other places, right? And so England is now having their moment that the Dutch had a couple centuries before, right? So, but we're going to see some similar ideas that are starting to emerge, right? So, or re-emerge, I guess. But some of the problems that we see with this, right? So these are just reminders, right? Rembrandt's Nicholas Rutz, right? The idea of focusing on wealth, or Frans Hal's The Merry Drinker. The idea here is if you don't focus on industry and thrift and sobriety, then you're not going to have the opportunities of the bourgeoisie dream. So the idea is to control yourself. And Nicholas Mace does a similar idea. He's another Dutch painter who encapsulates some of this idea of the bourgeoisie dream, where you have the idle servant and you have here the head maid coming in and the idle servant is asleep and there's all these dirty dishes that surround her. She's lazy, so this is a condemnation of, being lazy and not working. And so the focus of the bourgeoisie dream is, since people are no longer born into their place and they're free to choose who they are and what they're going to become, the idea here is that since you are no longer born in your place, you can become rich, and anyone can become rich. It's open for anyone. And then there's the effect of that is then on the hatred of poverty, right? If you are poor, then according to this mindset, you've chosen to be poor. You are lazy. You are somehow unintelligent, or haven't taken advantage of the opportunities that have been afforded to you. And so poverty does take a hit during this time. There's not necessarily as much emphasis on helping people who are below you because you're focused on getting up and moving up that socioeconomic ladder, and you have this it's kind of hatred towards those that are below you or underneath you, and suggesting that they obviously haven't worked hard enough to be where you are, right? And then there's this unyielding faith in the business class. So the business class are the people that are the most, the brightest, the smartest, the most efficient. The idea that industry is the solution to all social, economic, political problems, that the business class is going to lead and direct society, right? So this idea that's this intense focus on wealth and gaining more wealth, right? So that is a big part of the equation. John Stuart Mill continued, right? He says, with the recent social changes, society broke down and became able to rise above their circumstances. Thus, there was a feeling of class mobility and flexibility. The aristocracy was willing to marry with commoners, and the commoners were able to buy castles. And we see that represented with Hogarth's The Marriage Contract. And we've examined this one before, where the aristocracy is now going to the merchant class for their wealth, for their resources, and they're willing to mingle with one another, when before that was never even considered, right? The aristocracy would never mingle with the commoners, right? They were considered better than them. But now there's a change in social values, a change in ideas. Other changes that are going to lead to some major social conditions is the rise of urbanization. With the increase of industries in cities such as London, New York, Paris, there is an increasing desire for people to move out of their villages and go to the cities for economic opportunity, right? And one of the main advantages that industries offered was a weekly paycheck. If you grew up on a farm, and as many did in these rural areas, you would only get a paycheck once a year, right? And it was contingent upon good weather. It was contingent upon crop prices. It was contingent upon a lot of things. And a lot of farmers had to go into massive debt to be able to pay for their seeds, to pay for keeping the crops going, to pay for labor. It was a huge upfront expense with the hope that you're going to get paid at the end of all the labors. And so, in a lot of ways, farming was a risky venture that led to a lot of debt and struggles and whatnot. But if you're going to the city and working in a factory, it doesn't matter, how the industry is doing, they're going to pay you an hourly wage. And that was consistent. And people like that idea of job security. And so what you see is, for the first time in modern history, more people are now living in cities than they were in the rural areas. And so there's this huge boon in population in these areas. And this is going to bring about some, social effects and social problems that we'll take a look at. But one of them is this idea of estrangement, that people live in their kind of family homes in their villages for generations, right? Their families live there for centuries. And now they're going into cities where they're strangers. They don't know anyone around them. A lot of times they're moving to different countries where they don't speak the language. And so there's this feeling of alienation, feeling of estrangement, feeling of anxiety, right? This idea of displacement that's happening during the time. That's all kind of happening during the 19th and into the early 20th century, this kind of social upheaval and being uprooted. Just taking a look at the population, right? Some of the numbers. And I want us to think about what this means. Not that you're going to be tested specifically on, what was the population of Paris in 1872. I won't test you on that, but I want you to think about what effect this is going to have. And this is going to get us to think about, what is the art going to be responding to, right? So Paris has a growth rate, and they did a population census about every 10 years. A 33% increase in 10 years, to a 13%, to a 27%, to an 8%, to another 8%. And so it almost doubles in size in about 50 years. And I want us to think about what kind of pressures that's going to put on a city, right? London, we see even greater growth, right? Growing 47% in 20 years, to another 36% in another 20 years. And then towards the end of the century, it's growing by 55%. So it grows from about 2 million people to about 6.5 million, right? So over 3 times in about 60 years, right? So that's going to put some amazing pressures on the particular city. New York, we see even greater growth, right? 84% in 10 years, right? This is people coming into Ellis Island, and the idea that they believe that in the United States the streets are paved with gold, and there's all this opportunity and freedoms, and so there's this mass influx of people coming in from all over the world in New York City. A lot of different cultures, a lot of diversity, and sometimes that diversity is gonna come to a head with a lot of frustration about these immigrants coming into the country and taking jobs, and there's gonna be some hatred of certain specific groups, right? 1860s, it grows by another 70, almost 70%. 1870s, another 40%. Another 10 years, 35, then 36, and then 46. And so it grows from 320,000 to 3.8 million. So about 10 times the size in about 6 years, right? Tremendous pressure. And I give you the hypothetical, right, Rexburg, of what kind of pressures that's going to put on people. In 2017, the census was about 28,000. I think COVID has brought in quite a bit more. There's been quite a tremendous growth since COVID. And then just hypothetically, if it kept the New York, right, I don't think we've had this much growth, but if we were on par with New York's growth at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, we would have 52,000 people in just a couple of years from now. And then if we grew again, right, 88,000, then 123, and then by 2077 we'd have about 330,000, right? Think about Rexburg in terms of student population, in terms of the lack of housing, in terms of the lack of job opportunities. When you have more and more people coming into the area, what's going to happen to those resources, right? If we already have a housing crisis, sort of, in Rexburg, this is going to put even more strain on that. So what's going to happen to the housing prices? When there's a huge demand and little supply, the prices are going to go through the roof, right? And conversely, on the other side of this, when there's a large labor supply and few jobs, what's going to happen to the wages is the wages are going to go way down, right? And so this is going to lead to a tremendous discrepancy, and people are not getting paid a lot of money, and they have to pay a lot for housing. And so they feel that they feel this kind of economic pinch, right? And with massive inflation that's happening and population problems in the housing market again going kind of out of control, I think we can kind of empathize for what was happening at the in the late part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, right? Karl Marx was a German philosopher and economist. And he was exiled from Germany for his radical ideas. They said thanks, but no thanks. And so he spent most of his life in London. And he's taken a look at London during this time here, right? During these kind of economic conditions. And he writes with another economist the manifesto of the Communist Party. And what he mainly argues in this is that this kind of system of low wages and high rent isn't going to last long. And so he's taking a look at this idea of industrialism. We call it today capitalism. And he says that this just doesn't make sense, that there's not enough securities for the working class. They don't have any protections. There's no kind of government oversight to try to control the rising prices of housing. There's no control in terms of the low cost of wages. Or the low pay for wages, I should say. And so there's no intervention. And so the worker is just completely left to his or her own. And that's going to lead to economic poverty. And it's going to lead eventually, in his mind, what he argues, he's kind of predicting here, it's going to lead to a massive revolution. When you can't afford food and you can't afford a home, and yet you're working, in this case, in the late 19th century, some of them were working like 18 hours a day, right? So that's huge, right? That's a lot. So they don't even have time for kind of a social life for themselves. They just go home, go to sleep, and they have to go back to work, and they're working 6 days a week. And so he's just saying that this kind of system isn't gonna last. And you have some neighborhoods in London where you have 28 people living in one apartment. You have multiple families that are living in one apartment because they're trying to pool their resources together to be able to make rent, right? And I think we're kind of feeling a little bit of that pinch today, right? So here's what he argues, right? The bourgeoisie, and what he means by bourgeoisie, and what I mean by the bourgeoisie dream, is that these are the people that were the working class that then rose above their status to become part of the wealthy class. And so the bourgeoisie during Industrial Revolution or during capitalism are the ones that are the leaders, the owners of industry, right? So these today would be like the Elon Musks or the Jeff Bezos, right? The people that were part of the kind of lower classes at one time and then rose above, and now they have this, $1 billion worth, right? And they're the ones kind of leading and directing, right? And what he argues is the bourgeoisie, whenever it got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, and idyllic relations. And so what he means by this is when the bourgeoisie came to power during the Industrial Revolution, what they wanted to do is they wanted to get rid of all of the old medieval feudal guilds. And what a guild was a trade union that would determine the price and cost of production. So if you were part of the wool guild or the clothmakers guild, the clothmakers would determine how much you could produce in a given year, and what that would do is it would regulate the prices. And so what the capitalists do or the industrialists do is they say, you know what, we don't want someone telling me how much to produce and how much to sell it for. I get to determine that. I want the freedom. This is the idea of the free market. And so they say, we're going to get rid of all of that idea. We don't care about guilds. We don't care about trade unions. We want to have the control, right? And so they tore all of that out, right? And he's arguing that that's a problem because that it left people unprotected, right? That's his main argument. It left people unprotected, right? You can argue whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. He sees it as a bad thing because he suggests that the working class is now completely left to, without any type of protections. He says it is pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors and left nothing between man and man than naked self-interest and callous cash payment. And so in some ways it was positive in that it tore away this whole idea that people are bound to their natural superiors, this whole idea that you're born into your place due to your bloodline. He says, industrialists, people that are, focusing on economy, they don't really care about bloodlines. What they care about is making more money. And so it's tore apart that, which is a good thing. But in so doing, it's left nothing between each other than man and man than callous cash payment. And so there's nothing other that connects us other than money. And so what he suggests by this is that we are become defined based on our net worth. That's the only thing that really defines us. It's not necessarily that you have you have a knight in your pedigree in the past, right? It's not so much that you have, some type of chivalrous or some type of connection to the king and queen in your bloodline. We don't really care about that anymore, right? Some people, as we take a look at genealogy, we might find that we're, connected to some royal family down the road. And it make an interesting story during Sunday school, but for the most part, it doesn't really do anything for us. And so we don't really care about that, right? So capitalism has changed all of that, right? In some ways, it's for the positive, right? In other ways, the only way that we have now to define ourselves is our net worth, and that becomes the emphasis, it becomes the focal point, which becomes a problem, right? He says, in proportion as the bourgeoisie developed, in the same proportion as the proletariat, and the proletariat is this new working class, right? The poor, right? So the bourgeoisie is now the upper class, the proletariat is now the working class. The modern working class developed as the class of laborers, and that the labor spelling here is the English spelling, right? He's living in England, who live only so long as they find work. These laborers must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition and the fluctuation of the market, right? So the problem with the bourgeois or the proletariats is when the housing market is, when housing prices are down, there tends to be lower wages, there tends to be less economic opportunities, and so they can't get in on the ground floor of the the lower housing market. But when the economy is booming and things are kind of picking up and there's a lot of cash running around, then what happens is the market goes up, the housing prices go up, and so then they're still struggling to be able to buy those houses, right, or buy those products, whatever the case may be. And so they're subject to the fluctuations of the market. When the market is good, the bourgeoisie or the proletariat's doing well, and when the market's doing bad, the proletariat is doing poorly, right? Whereas the bourgeoisies, yes, they are subject to the fluctuation of the market. When the market's doing well, they do well. When the market's not doing as well, then they're not doing as well. But they still have a lot of cash. And so they can go in, for instance, in the 2008 economic downturn, when there was a lot of foreclosures, a lot of wealthy people came in and bought those houses at a very cheap rate. They held on to them because they had the economic means to do so. And then when the market rebounded, they then sold them for a profit, right? The average person couldn't do that, right? So one of the challenges the proletariat faces is the problems of being bound to your job and being bound to the economy, right? People can't just walk away from their jobs generally because they need them to be able to live, right? And so they become, bound to the market. He says also one of the challenges, owing to the excessive use of machinery and the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He has become an appendage of the machine and is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. And so what we see here is the main focus of industry in terms of the assembly line, in terms of factory work, is to try to simplify everything as simple as it can be. So if that one person quits, it doesn't shut down the entire assembly line. And so they're trying to make everything as simple and dumbed down as possible, so that then if someone has to leave or, retires or whatever, the whole industry can keep on moving, right? But the problem with that, though, is that you go to work and you kind of become a zombie, right? You're just kind of doing the same thing over and over and over. It becomes quite boring. It becomes quite dehumanizing. It becomes, it's just mind-numbing work, right? And so if you go to any grocery store or whatever, you see the checkout clerk that's just kind of scanning things, right? And not really doing anything other than scanning and then hitting the total button, and the machine does everything, right? Tells what the total is, tells what, the change is going to be. And the whole idea of this is you want the whole mechanized system to be as easy as possible, because you don't want to have to spend a lot of time training someone, and you don't want to have to spend a lot of time replacing someone, right? But the problem is the work then becomes very mundane and problematic. He also examines that the ideas that the proletariat is going to grow in wealth with this because they're going to benefit from this kind of system, where the working class is going to not benefit from this system, right? As the bourgeoisies gain economic might, they then turn that into political leverage, and then they start making rules that benefit them and not necessarily that benefit the proletariats, right? So he's arguing that this is going to be a greater problem. And this just shows you some of the market trends since the early 20th century and into the 21st century. The red line represents the top 5%, the bourgeoisies, and the blue line represents the average income. So the average income has not really increased over the last 100 years. But if you take a look at the super rich, right, they have benefited. And so the rich keep getting richer. And the median class here kind of stays the same, and the poor keeps getting poorer and poorer. And then the second chart on the right-hand side just shows the growth of CEO pay in terms of the 1960s to the 2000s, and then the economic downturn in 2008 kind of changes that a little bit. But I think they've rebounded since then. But the average compensation for the CEO has boomed, whereas the average worker pay has actually not even has it gone up. It's stayed the same, except for it has not adjusted for inflation. So a lot of workers are getting paid, a lot of factory workers are getting paid what people were actually getting paid in the 1970s, their actual income, right? Not adjusted for inflation. So again, so the people that are kind of subject to the fluctuations of the market keep kind of going down in terms of their economic abilities, where the people that are benefiting from this is they are getting richer and richer. And the one might question, well, why does this system keep going on? Why don't people question this? Why don't people say, hey, well, what's going on, that this is a problem? And the answer is there's this whole idea of we call it the American dream. The whole idea is that one day you could be in that top 5%, or you could be a CEO of your own company. And so I'm not going to call foul, because I'm going to be sitting at the dinner table with them at some point. And so why don't I just be quiet for the moment, not complain, and then I'll be able to benefit from this kind of system in the future. So the American dream helps to kind of promote that idea, right? Some of the other effects, social effects that happen with this, with the lowering power of the proletariats and the high housing costs, the low wages, people living in multifamily homes, it leads to a lot of alcoholism. It leads to people trying to escape life for a moment and going into the bars. And so alcohol rates during the 19th century are on the rise. And then there's another movement called prohibition that's happening to try to combat some of those social vices and social problems. But one of them is to try to escape, right? And so here you see Degas, who we'll take a look at when we take a look at Impressionism, and the absinthe drinker. And the absinthe is this drink here, this alcoholic drink that has this kind of yellowish green color to it. It's made from wormwood. Don't know if you really need to know that, but it's a very potent, almost narcotic, and it's illegal. It was legal throughout most of the world at the time, but then they said, you know what, this is too much. And so it's illegal everywhere except for England. So there's a random fact for you, but it's very cheap and a very quick way to get to kind of escape from the world. And so this idea of escapism, right? Continuing on with Marxist ideas, and this is just going to contextualize what's going on with realism, what's going on with Impressionism, and what they're responding to, right? They're responding to this second wave of the Industrial Revolution. He says all history is a history of class struggle. So he says if you look at any historical moment, whether it's the French Revolution, whether it's the American Revolution, whether it is, the Crusades or whatever the case may be, he argues that it can really be focused on this idea of class struggle, the struggle between the haves and the have-nots. Those who have resources want to maintain them, and those that don't want to get them, right? So there's a constant battle. Whether that's true or not, that's that's up for debate. Whether we can boil all history down to a very simplistic economic struggle. Maybe we, in some ways, maybe not in other ways. But it's an interesting way of seeing the world, and his ideas are going to be widely influential, right? So we need to know them. We need to know what he's arguing, because he's going to influence artists of the 19th century, and he's going to be extremely influential in the 20th century when we see what's happening in Russia, when we see, throughout Asia and South America, these ideas are going to be predominant, right? People are going to say, hey, wait, why are we accepting the system the way it is? We need change. And then he also says this. He says, owing to the excessive use of machinery and the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character. And I want you to think about, your own individual jobs. Does this describe your job? And in many ways, I think it describes a lot of people's jobs, right? Proletarians have lost all individual character and consequently all charm of the workman. He has become an appendage of the machine and is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. And so, in opposed to the Middle Ages, when you have a craftsman and you would develop a table or a chair, right? You were a carpenter. You would work on that chair or table, whatever it was, throughout the day. And then at the end of the day, you had an actual product. That product was yours and yours alone. And then you would put it into the market and then you would sell it, right? That idea of your labor is yours, and then you can sell it for whatever price that you determine or whatever price the market determines. But you had that connection. But if you're a factory worker and you go to your job, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a factory worker, it could be Walmart, it could be Amazon, it could be anything, but you go to your job and you do your labor, you don't own your labor. Your labor is being paid for you, and at the end of the day, your product is not your own. And so if you're, for instance, working in the car industry and you're working on a car, at the end of the day, that car is not yours. It's owned by Ford or it's owned by Toyota or whoever it might be. And so you don't have any connection to your labor, right? And so he says that also is a dehumanizing kind of problem between between things that we like to be able to create things as human beings. But this is changing those dynamics, right? We're not really owning what we make anymore. Let's take a look at realism, right? So that's just some context of what's going on, and let's take a look at how art is responding to this, right? Realism was an art and literary movement that began in the 1850s. It reacted, and so Marx writes the Communist Manifesto in 1848, right? So this is about 2 years, a little bit later after that. And it's not to suggest that they're kind of reading Marx in the background. It's just that they're responding to the same events. They're seeing the same things, and they're representing the same things, right? And so Marx is writing the Communist Manifesto in English, maybe translated into German to some extent. But a lot of the realists are happening within France and the United States. It's a question of whether, how much they would actually have known of Marx at the time. So again, it's not to say that they are directly influenced by him, but it is to suggest that they're responding to the same historical events, right? So we have kind of two ideas that are reflecting similar concerns at the same time, right? Realism reacted against Romanticism's overly emotional and sensational elements. So this idea that it didn't want to kind of have this over kind of extremism of Romanticism. It wants to focus more on these kind of gritty elements of real life. Realism depicted the importance of day-to-day events and urges to find the extraordinary in the ordinary. We've seen that before with the Baroque era, right? Realist literature stresses minute details of daily life in order to find the truths that are embedded around all of us. Writers such as Émile Zola, Mark Twain, Stephen Crane, Henri de Balzac, André Dumas, and Anton Chekhov, Leo Tolstoy, etc., were part of the realist movement. In art, realism focuses more on social commentary and examines how the modern industrial world negatively affects the poorest people, right? And this is what we're going to take a look at, right? Let's take a look at some examples of realism, right? This idea of what does realism looks like. Let's take a look at Gustave Courbet. He states, "I have studied the art of the ancients and the art of the moderns, avoiding any preconceived system and without prejudice. I no longer want to make one then copy the other," right? So he's like, I'm not really going to go back to the ancients. I'm not really going to focus on what they're doing in terms of his day. As what's in vogue is Romanticism. So he says, I want to do something different. The world has changed, and so art needs to change as well, right? He doesn't say that, but that's kind of the mindset of where he's coming from. To know in order what to do, that was my idea. To be in a position to translate the customs, the ideas, the appearance of my time, according to my own estimation. To be not only a painter, but a man as well. In short, to create living art. That is my goal, to create the world around him and just to reflect this. And so to be kind of this surveillance camera, so to speak, to just reflect what people are like, right? Not to necessarily exaggerate it, not exactly to focus on things that are beyond human reason or the supernatural, just to focus on day-to-day events. That's it, right? That's what realism is all about. And here we see his wheat sifters, where you have women going about their labors, their day-to-day labors, and they're just sifting wheat. They're separating the chaff from the berries, right? And they're kind of meticulous in their labors, kind of picking one individually out, or this one has a little sifter here and just sifting everything out to leave the berries, right? Similar ideas that we see in Stonebreakers, right? Just representing daily life. Now, this is different from Romanticism in terms of the colors are much more muted, right? Much more the kind of earth tones, trying to be more realistic than kind of exaggerated. We do see some kind of contrast between light and shading. We can see that the hill behind them is in the shadow, probably by some trees, and the sun's kind of behind them, casting these large shadows. And then these two laborers, an older man and a young boy, going out and they're breaking stones, working with their hands, laboring. And so in some ways, it is kind of romantic to a certain extent because of the intimate detail that we see in their honest labor. But it's different because it's not necessarily exaggerated. You're just showing. He's just showing them kind of the young boy carrying the rocks, and then the older gentleman that is breaking them with the hammer. It's just this kind of day to day, what day to day work looks like. What is it? What is the labor of the working class look like, right? And he's representing that. Now he's also providing some honor to it. He's providing some kind of some insights into to kind of thinking about them and their labor as this kind of romantic kind of way. And so in some ways that is a romanticization of labor, but he's trying to do it in a different way, a different context than what romanticism. It's not elaborate, it's not exaggerated, right? Where we have with Jacques-Louis David and Napoleon, or Napoleon crossing the Saint Bernard, what we have is just a very elaborate, extreme rendition. Not necessarily, I mean, in some ways it's loosely tied to history, but not really focusing on historical facts. What we see with Courbet is he wants to be more of a camera that does focus on what the world around them looks like, right? We see with his Burial at Ornans, we see a similar kind of idea. This is the funeral of his uncle. And he just found people that represented the small town that he lived in. And so he just wanted to capture small town life, not necessarily what the aristocracy looks like or what the bourgeoisies look like. He just wants to represent real people, right? And so this is real people dealing with loss, coping with the funeral, coping with their own mortality in the kind of the back of their minds. This is just what life is about, right? It's not necessarily a representation of a saint's death. It doesn't necessarily have to be, right? This is just the common man's death, and that affects everyone, right? So he's given us this insight, this detailed focus on a particular individual that's not necessarily important in terms of the larger socio-political landscape, but is important in terms of the people of the town, that the people of the town have this connection, have this kind of family connection to him, right? So that kind of brings us into that intimate space to feel their pain, right? Again, notice the color palette's it's dark earth tones, right? Focusing more on our attention on, rather than the colors, more on the emotion of the people, right? And their real life struggle, right? Very different from what we see with Goya's 3rd of May, right? An earlier representation in 1814 of the Spaniards that revolted against Napoleon's army, that were mercilessly put to death, right? Romanticizing the idea of loss, the idea of heroism, the ideas of courage and bravery. We see that kind of here, but it's much more muted, right? The heroism and bravery, I mean, he didn't necessarily die for a larger cause. He just died due to, natural causes. But his life of living day to day, his life of being just an average person, is kind of heroic, right? That's what we should be focusing on, is just the real life events, or what we see with Géricault and his raft of the Medusa, right? This idea of this extreme moment in the early part of the 19th century, where there were people that were caught off the coast of Senegal and they were waiting for a ship for 13 days, right? Their struggle, right? Their struggle of human survival, right? But their heroism of staying together, kind of huddled together in this kind of ultra dramatic fashion. This is much more kind of muted. It's not really about the over emotional, right? We do see some similarities in terms of the composition. They're kind of cluttered together, yes. But the diagonal composition, the kind of the asymmetrical composition, it gives it that feeling that it's kind of off or unbalanced, which makes it more emotional. This one is not about trying to evoke those kinds of emotions. The emotions here are more quiet and subdued, right? Let's take a look at Jean-Francois Millet in his The Sower, right? He's much more expressive, and maybe we can even argue to some extent somewhat more romantic in his representations of poverty. But he was born in a small village in northern France in Normandy, and he came from a humble background and had a deep conviction to the rural life that his background represents. And so this is what he really wants to emphasize. And he faced financial difficulties throughout his life. And in 1849, he moves to Paris, and he sees what's happening in Paris in terms of the Industrial Revolution and the major urbanization conflicts that are happening there, and those kinds of pressures. He experiences greater economic difficulties there, and then he decides to kind of leave and start painting people outside the city life, the people in the country life. And here, what we see with the Sowar, this is probably his most famous work. We see very similar to Courbet, the use of earth tones, kind of these muted earth tones with a darker kind of lighting that's going to be common in a lot of Millet's works. But here we see the farmer that's going off and he's sowing the seeds, planting the seeds for growth. And then in the background, we see these birds here that are eating up the seeds. And so this idea of honest labor, this idea of honest work, in a time when poverty is looked down upon, in a time when people that are struggling, they're suggesting you're struggling is because you're lazy and you haven't taken advantage of the opportunities. Millet is humanizing these people. He's suggesting, no, that's a little bit simplistic to say that the poor have chosen to be poor. No one's going to really choose to be poor, right? They may have had a limited access to opportunities in terms of education, in terms of social economic advancement, but they have honor in their labors. And so here he provides this intimate detail of this person who's earnestly struggling to make ends meet. And yet the world around him, right, the environment around him is extremely harsh. And so it's a little bit simplistic to just say that anyone can rise above their socioeconomic circumstances. Sometimes the world around individuals make it more challenging than others. And I like how he has this dark shadow across the face, right? So we really can't see his eyes. We really can't see his individuality. Because to Millet, his individuality doesn't matter, right? He's representing the common man or the everyman that has this same kind of struggle. And this one is The Gleaners. Similar ideas, but this is representing women instead of the men struggling. And rather than the Sowar, which is focusing on the beginning of the harvest, where they're planting the seeds, this is at the end of the harvest, where you have the harvesters loading up the hay on the wagon, and then the horses are pulling the carts forward to go to the miller to get the wheat turned into flour. And what we see at the foreground, though, so that's all happening in the background, right? They're all kind of leaving the field at the end of the day. What we see are these women that go into the field and they pick up what was left behind. The little grains that the people here that were working in the field all day, that were laboring, didn't have time to go and pick up every single grain. These women come in driven by their extreme poverty and go in and collect this so that they can make ends meet. And so these are the laborers after the laborers. And so this kind of divide, the social divide that we see. On the top, we see the people that own the farm. They then hire the workers. And then below even them, they're the people that have to go in and clean up due to their own poverty and their own destitute work. Now, Millet can take a look at these individuals and say, kind of make fun of them or mock them for being poor. But instead, he shows their honest labor, right? They kind of this back breaking, they're kind of hunched over, lifting up the grains of seeds, and he provides this kind of honesty about them, right? But different from what we've seen with Romanticism in terms of Lady Liberty leading the people, this kind of great movement of, focusing on, yes, the working class, uniting everyone, coming together. Similar kind of ideas in terms of social commentary. Both of them are social commentaries. This is a social commentary on the problems of, the second wave of the Industrial Revolution and how it's affected the poorest. This is kind of a social commentary on people and what they want, freedom, opportunities, right? People want freedom and opportunities, a similar kind of focus, but a different way of approaching it, right? This is more about symbolism. This is more about evoking, this idea of political reform. The idea of there's no real politically overt message here. It's to bring awareness, yes, but it's not suggesting who to vote for in an election. It's not suggesting what to do, what to go about it. What you choose to do about your awareness is up to you, right? But he's just casting a spotlight on it. Different kind of approach to social commentary between realism and what we see with Romanticism. And then this one is the Norman Milkmaid, right? So she is coming at the end of her labors, right? So she has to wake up extremely early, milk the cows, and so this is the end of her day, but the beginning of someone else's day as she then brings the milk to, the farm, the farmhouse, and then another maid has to then make the breakfast and whatnot with the milk. But focusing on the labors, and look how she's kind of hunched over as she has this kind of rope that goes over her back over her head down to her arm to be able to balance the heavy jug, and her posture is kind of leaning forward with the extreme weight, focusing on the labor, the heaviness of it. And then we have this kind of natural lighting that gives her this subtle glow, this kind of angelic glow that we've seen in other art of the Baroque era or even of the Renaissance. Giving her this kind of angelic quality, but her face is still darkened, so it's not necessarily about her individuality. She just represents anyone coming from this area, coming from poverty. She's kind of the every woman of that, demonstrating the struggles of the people of the time. Taking a look at Henri Dumier, he was a French artist, similar to the last two that we've taken a look at. And he was widely regarded as one of the most important and influential figures due to his social commentary, perhaps even satires that he's created. He's heavily influenced by what's happening in the Dutch, right? The Dutch areas. And so he's kind of going back and bringing those ideas forward. We see similar ideas that are happening with Malay and the like with other realists. But what we see here, this is the focus on the third-class wagon, right? So train cars would have their different components, different compartments to it. This one, they're all huddled together. They're all kind of crammed in. This woman in the foreground, he humanizes her by she's bringing a basket to the market to sell whatever she's made. They have a woman that's kind of nestling her young infant next to her, kind of huddled together, and then the young boy who's just completely tuckered out and sleeping. But there's this idea that, yes, they're huddled together. Yes, they're this kind of the unknown masses, right? That kind of their faces are all kind of caricatures and less detailed, right? Kind of darkened here. But it's trying to humanize this event, showing their struggles, casting a spotlight on what they're actually going through and what they're actually struggling with, right? Just taking a look at Manet. Manet also was heavily influenced by the old masters of Velázquez and Goya, and wants to kind of take their style and then do something new with it within a kind of this new age, this new era that he's representing. I just want to take a look at these three works in kind of together, just because I think they fit very similarly. You have the Absinthe Drinker, which we've taken a look at, the Absinthe Drinker with Degas' Absinthe Drinker. This one is a similar subject, right? Different kind of representation. Here is this man that's just kind of out. He has a top hat on and a coat, trying to portray himself the best way that he can. But the absinthe drink here is just his idea of escaping the complexities and confusions of life and all of the pressures. So this idea that this modern world isn't necessarily that panacea, right? This whole idea of the Victorian hope and faith in tomorrow, that we are at the cusp, the pinnacle of human development, and everything is going to be great from here on out. All the social problems are going to be solved. That the business leaders that are taking over, they're going to make the world the best it can be. They're suggesting that that's a little simplistic and maybe a little bit too hopeful. There's going to be some clear problems with this one. This one's kind of interesting. The Philosopher. I love the lighting. That looks very similar to what we see with the Dutch masters that are happening during the Baroque era. We have the lighting coming down, which apparently is either the moonlight or some street light coming down on his face. And then we have the oysters down here at his feet. This is a beggar who's begging for his evening meal. And then we have the oysters, which are representative of excess and kind of the more lavish lifestyle, kind of juxtaposed with him, demonstrating that this kind of challenge that he faces, right? He's kind of surrounded with wealth and excess, but yet he doesn't have access to it. And so the question is, I mean, we can look down at him and say, well, obviously you're too, whatever to actually get a job or to become an industrialist. But what we see with Manet is he's trying to humanize that. We see similar ideas with the rag picker, who's just kind of going around about his day, picking garbage up, picking what he can, finding some type of sustenance, right? But what we see with Manet's paintings is generally characterized by simplified forms and this kind of distinctive color palette, this kind of very simple colors that are being used, a very simple color palette. And then using this kind of tenebrism that we've seen with the Dutch masters to juxtapose to focus on the lighting, right? So just to think about these artists together, right, as we think about what's going on during this realist period. One question to think about is how realist captures the changing socioeconomic landscape of the 19th century, how artists are responding to this. Why do you think they romanticized the work and the struggles of the poor? Why didn't they go this direction? They could have went the direction of Rococo and said, hey, let's just focus on the very wealthy, or with what we see with Rembrandt, hey, let's just paint the wealthy, right? I see the changing tide. Let's just kind of go to where the money is and just paint where the money is. They choose instead to go the opposite direction. And I think that that's an interesting phenomenon that's pretty unique and rare within art history, right? What do you think they're bringing awareness to? And why do you think they found it was important to bring awareness to? Just some interesting ideas to think about in terms of this kind of new modern, as we start to modernize and we see the birth of modernism happening, we're going to see art changing, and what artists are focusing on starts to change. And we see that beginning here with realists.